I was living in Washington, D.C., and I was, my wife wanted therapy, and she had just had a baby and was postpartum depression, and so she went to look for therapy, and I helped, and we found the branch of the Bioenergetics Institute that was in Washington, D.C. at the time, and she took therapy. And the therapy was kind of amazing. And so I decided I wanted also therapy. And so we did that. And then we began to hear about John Pierrakos. John Pierrakos was coming regularly to Washington from New York to train and to oversee that program. At that moment, the Bioenergetics Institute was trying to expand. So they had a branch in Washington and they had a second branch in Toronto. And Lowen would oversee the one in Toronto and John the one in Washington. So we decided we would go to a workshop, and that's where I met John Pierrakos. It was in 1972, and I remembered it the first time I saw him, certainly. It didn't seem very impressive to me, but it was a setup because everybody was talking about a magnificent man this was, and he walks in, he's about the same height as me, he's about the same weight as me, his accent's terrible in English, and he just talks stuff I didn't understand. So that was my first reaction to John Pierrakos. Who is this man? But by the end of the workshop, it was very clear to me that something magical was trying to happen. So eventually both my wife and I decided to train as bioenergetic therapists in that institute, which we did through 73, 74, 75. And in 75, we were finishing our training. And in the training, of course, you start to work with clients already before the end of the training. So we had the opportunity, we had a practice, numbers of clients, we had a space to go. It just seemed like that was what we were going to do. But we were also very burned out. It was a very intense program, 25 hours a week for 3 years, almost no stop. Okay. So we made a decision to spend the summer of 1975 in Phoenicia, because now by this time we have heard of that. So for 2 months, July and August of 1975, we went to Phoenicia, and we had 2 children. The children played. There were lots of other children there. It was a very safe environment. We worked on ourselves. There was groups and sessions, and I helped with the maintenance of the buildings, and she helped with the kitchen. And then in, I think more or less the last day of August, we were packing our stuff to go back in time for putting the children in school. And it was one of those moments, it looks like it's out of a movie, but it was exactly that way. We're on either side of the bed. I'm packing my stuff, she's packing her stuff, and at some point we just looked at each other and we said, "Why are we leaving?" And in a matter of maybe 3 days, we had made immense arrangements. We had my son has registered in the school. My daughter was only 5, so we didn't need immediate. We drove back to Washington, packed up our house, rented our house, said goodbye, and left in, I think, 5 days. So in no more than 10 days, we had completely changed our lives. And we were committed to that life for a while. It was very clear that John was leaving the Bioenergetics Institute, and he was developing what became CORE. by that time we got back in September of 1975, there were no it was not a training program that we knew. But we didn't want one. We had trained ourselves already, right? But then sometime before February, there was a meeting held in the big meeting area of Phoenicia where John announced that core was being developed, that we were now calling things that used to be called bioenergetic sessions were now going to be called core energetic sessions. But it was not just a change of name, it was to emphasize the integration of the spiritual elements of the pathwork. And at that point, in order to join the core training, you had to also be in the training of pathwork. So this was to be a supplement to the pathwork training. That actually didn't last very long, but that's the way it started. I decided I didn't want to take that training because of certain ego problems. And but my wife decided she's going to do it. And then, as I said, the day before the training is starting, John approached me and just basically assumed I was going to do it, so I did it. It was fun. It was very chaotic because John is the worst administrative person I ever met in my life. And everything is spontaneous with him. It's just, after a while you begin to see where he's going, but at first it's very hard. And there was a curriculum which we did not follow from the very first day. They handed us the curriculum, and when we went to the first class, it was different than the curriculum. And it was that way for the whole 3 years. When we were in Washington, he would only show up maybe 2 or 3 times a year. He would do what John does, and then we would have these trainings that were very good. And eventually, apparently they fulfilled the necessary criteria for Bioenergetics Institute because we received our certificate of graduation just like everybody in New York did. So there was not a lot of contact with John. But once I moved to Phoenicia, it was dramatically increased. He was there every weekend. He was available. He was doing all these kind of scientific experiments, and I'm a scientist, and we connected on that level. And eventually I started actually being kind of like his laboratory assistant of these different things he was trying to do. We were trying to grow seeds with hemispherical domes and with pyramids and different things like that. But of course, as soon as the training started, then it was much more intense. John would do these trainings. And then the next weekend when we were both in Phoenicia, I lived there and he came up, he would start telling me stuff that he forgot to tell us in training. And people would gather around him at the dining hall and the dinner table, the few people who were taking the training who were there. And we would get another lesson or 2, or at least a lecture anyway. And then the people who weren't there would hear that this happened. So eventually they wanted us to record these things, which we never did. I mean, this was in the 70s, so recording equipment was very clunky and big and heavy, and we never had the right equipment to do it. And nobody wanted to carry it into the dining hall and set it up anyway. Besides, it probably wouldn't have worked because there's all this chatter. It's a big dining hall. Right? So that's a flavor of the first year. The second year, when it began the same way, there was a rebellion in the class because most of the people in the class were rather professional already. We had trained and we had clients. Most people did. And we just kind of sat around and we said, this is not going to work for 2 more years. So we took the curriculum and made some modifications, but then we said, this is what we want, and if you don't give it to us, we're leaving. I'm not sure we would have done that, but at any rate, that's what we said. And John said, okay. And so we got to choose the teachers and the subjects for a while, except when John taught, and then he would come in and do anything he felt like doing. Right? And it's just not me. Everybody who was there knows that that's the way it was. And it was when he died. Lucia had the same experience in Brazil, and Teddy in Germany and stuff like that. And then it turned out to be pretty good because we brought in some really good teachers. We got a lot of study of psychodynamics as well as the body work. And we were all studying the path work too in a separate training. So it was really good training by the end. And there was a lot of contact with John during that time. He was fascinated with what he was creating, and he was very intent on having this to be a good training. So he was constantly asking, what's going on? How is this? But also, by his nature, he was gone a lot. He was constantly going different places in the world. So we would expect to see him at some training, and he just didn't show up because he forgot to tell us that he was going to Germany or to California or something. Oh, a group with John? Oh, that was fun. That was an exotic experience. You never knew what was going to happen. When John would get moving, when he would really get down focus, just completely lost track of time. We would have to drag him away to go have meals, and then everybody would dread if he would go back to work after dinner because it would be midnight or 1 o'clock before he got exhausted. He had endless energy. But it was fun. It was like half asleep, but then all of a sudden something magical would happen. And he kept pulling this magic out of his hat somehow over and over and over again. Even people who had been around him for years would be like startled by some of the stuff he would come up with. And so I never missed one if I could help it, because the usual things you imagine happened. People had deep cathartic experiences, people had recognitions, people would find new elements of their hidden emotions, they would have memories, they would have dreams. That did all happen. But I think that the thing that kind of kept it, the glue that kept it going, was that there seemed to be, we seemed to keep finding an endless new depth to what psychotherapy was all about. Down deeper and deeper and deeper. And of course there's the pathwork lectures, and people would read these, and a lot of it was, it's interesting, or it seems a little strange, or this. But in these workshops, just time after time, all of a sudden, something that the guide had said would suddenly make sense right there in front of your eyes. Okay? It was like, oh, that's not just some sort of esoteric, Far Eastern, some idea, okay? It's happening right here, right in front of us. And that really kept it very, very much alive. We lost that. By most standards, we've lost that, because we still have the lectures, and those who studied them have those experiences occasionally. But it was like John was able to pull out of somebody, or out of whatever he was working with, the embodiment, the actual physical reality of some of those lecture concepts. But you never knew. Okay, sometimes they were really boring. People would walk out saying, oh my God, John is just talking. So that would happen too. I don't want it to make it sound like it was, an endless feast. There was lots of times when it wasn't. By that time, we were very motivated. The pathwork was flourishing. I mean, at some point, I think we had over 1,000 members in the New York area. It was a kind of happening. Several rather famous people like Cher was involved, and Peter Boyle was involved, and people like that. There were a lot of people who became famous names. She and John lived in New York, but they came to Phoenicia every weekend, and she would stay there most of the summer. So we had a lot more contact with her. And then since they bought the property, there was now a legal organization. And so they had the usual stuff. You have to keep records. You have to put in reports to the government and stuff because it was a nonprofit organization. By the second year I was there, I had become the manager of the place. So I had to have a lot of discussion with them because they were terrible. They didn't want to do all this paperwork and all this stuff. And I'm not a lawyer, but their lawyers kept telling them, you better get this done, okay, if you don't have it on time. And there were fines because they didn't fill out the paperwork and get it in on time. The kind of bureaucracy that government is. So I had a lot of contact with them about that kind of stuff. And then there was questions of where the money's coming from for various repairs and maintenance, and enormous amount of snow in the wintertime. It's up in the mountains. And they didn't want to buy the very expensive equipment to keep the place open. So they were constantly complaining to me about how their cars were getting stuck and ice wasn't removed and this, that, and the other. I'm fine with it now. I accept that they didn't have the money, but I really had a hard time trying to get over the fact that they were coming to me, calling me. Eva would call you at any time of the day or night. Absolutely any time. 4 o'clock in the morning, she wakes up and she thinks of something that should be done, and she'll call you right there. So now I look at that time and I think, it was glorious. It was like wonderful. It was like expansive and fun. My kids were flourishing. My marriage was going through ups and downs, and eventually ended after 7 years there. Altogether, I stayed there 13 years. My ex left after we got divorced, and my daughter went with her. My son had already graduated from college and was out on the West Coast. And I was really tired of being manager, so I quit and turned it over to somebody who's now in the Dutch group. He was living there at the same time. So that's the sociology part of this discussion. In addition to the Phoenicia Center, they bought a building in New York City. And since I was part of managing that. It was the same organization. So we developed that building into therapy offices. And John had his office there. I had my office there. I think there were maybe 10 offices for people who had graduated from core therapy. So this building was kind of humming with screams and yells and things like that. But we also had community meetings there and a lot of activities. I was living in Phoenicia, which is 3 hours distance. So I don't know all the things that they did there, but they were developing. Eva's idea was that the pathwork is going to develop aspects of science, of art, of therapy, of business. And I think one more, but I forgot what it is. But at any rate, there was a science group, there was a business group, and there was et cetera, artistic group. Remember, Eva's profession was modern dance. She was a theater person. So we set up a dance studio at the center and put on performances, which then eventually went to New York and were put on. But when Eva died in 1979, it didn't take very long for things to start falling apart, because John fell apart. This was a huge blow to him. And he never had the capacity to be a good administrator, first of all, but also, and just his whole life fell apart. Chaos set in. And then the discussions evolved into fights and nasty letters, and eventually a number of process groups, which very often struck on a rock, which is, who's going to lead the process? You have an agenda here, you can't lead the process. Yeah, but you have that kind of stuff for months. And what evolved from that was that a lot of people just left. A lot of the donations stopped. A lot of the people who used to come regularly to Phoenicia and pay for room and board stopped coming. And we had a really serious cash problem, financial problem. So we ended up selling the building in the city for very good money, like, I don't know. And that settled the financial problems for a while, but what came beyond that was, well, who's watching the money? And who has the authority? And the way we resolved that was that the people who lived in New York decided that the pathwork in New York was their business, and the people who lived in Phoenicia, we decided we would take over and run Phoenicia. There was also a group in Virginia which had what's now Seven Oaks, which is another center. It still exists. And from roughly 1984, I think, or 3 or 4, until 1898, the people who lived at the Pathwork Center in Phoenicia ran the center. John was absent in any kind of administrative way. He had his house at Phoenicia, but I think for a while he didn't even want to come there because that was Eva there. And within 2 years, he is remarried into what was a disastrous marriage. And this left John even more bewildered, I think, for a while. He was still capable of going and doing his therapy and going and doing his travels around the world. But the ability to run the Core Institute or run the Pathwork was just, he was absent. So we found ways to do that. And he would sign off the necessary papers if we put them under his nose at the right time. And eventually, I think he just lost interest in trying to be an administrator. He wanted to do his teaching, he wanted to do his creative work, he wanted to do his therapy. And because of that, he was robbed at least 3 times, significant amounts of money by people that he hired to work for him. So we were constantly trying to help him recover from one of these things. And I know that he died eventually in serious debt. Stuart knows the details, I don't care. Life evolved. Stuart was one of the people who tried to help John keep this thing grounded enough so that it didn't fall apart. Charlie Corley was another one in New York. I was focused on Phoenicia until we sold it. I actually stopped teaching at the Core Institute for maybe 5 years while the major turmoil was going on in Phoenicia. But then I went back, and I've been doing it ever since. I guess the best I can say is that Stuart saved his ass. Stuart brought some significant level of order to the whole thing. But even then, all Stuart had was the Institute. John let his personal finances get all mixed up in it, and these people figured this all out that robbed him. And they were able to do this through his own personal bank account without Stuart figuring out what was going on. We almost lost the Institute, quite frankly, when John died. And I now know how he saved it, but I didn't know at the time. But it required some very, very, shall we say, complex legal maneuvering. Stuart got some lawyers, and we put together the necessary paperwork, and he saved it, quite frankly. And then after roughly 7 years after John died, then Stuart decided it's time to make it a real board and, open things up. I don't know why he did that, but that's the way he did it, and it worked. Along the way, he seemed to make some enemies, which is something that happens with many leaders, but I became a member of that new board, still am, and we have made a roaring success of it now. It's in great shape. Along the way, before John died, we tried to keep him involved, but he really wasn't the leader of the institution anymore. He was the leader of the spirit of CORE, very much so. He was bringing enthusiastic people from all over the world into it, quite necessary. He started CORE in Brazil after Eva died. I think he started CORE in Uruguay as well, and maybe in France. I know he was working there. That never developed like it did in Brazil. And then, of course, he already had it in Germany and Italy and in California and in Mexico. So those are the places it was flourishing. And his work near the end was to try to make an actual legal international CORE institution. But that never happened. Now it's legally centered in each country. There's no international organization. And these leaders now are trying to see what kind of relationship is going to be built. I don't think it's ever going to be, in my lifetime anyway, an international organization, one organization. It's going to be, but we are trying to make the trainings fit together so that somebody can train in New York for 2 years and then go and finish in Holland or something like that. And when a person graduates in Holland, they have the same credentials as, not credentials because the legal issue is a whole separate thing, but they have the same certificate that they have in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So all that's going to be slowly worked out over time. The last time somebody asked me that, I thought, what I said was it was disgusting. And what I meant was that they were like these two teenagers all the time, okay? They were just like, we'd be in a business meeting and we were really dealing with heavy stuff and people are trying to get Eva especially to make a decision, and Eva would examine every little possible detail and alternative for anything that was difficult. And she would try to find the spiritual force that was supposed to come through. Okay? And the next thing you know, John and Eva are kissing, and they're like cooing with each other and talking. And it would happen over and over again, people. Oh, God. And sometimes it would go on for, 10 minutes at a time or something. And then we'd hear a story about something or other in their life. So that's one of the flavors there was. But Eva could just haul off and and yell at John too, right in the middle of everything, and say, "That's crazy, John, stop that. This is da-da-da," and she would give him a psychological analysis right there in the middle of the board meeting. And John would go, "Oh, yeah, you're right, yeah." And John thrived on that. He just talked about how important that was, how that this was so vital to his process. She lived in New York. He lived in New York, both. He had left his wife. He was living somewhere, I don't know. This was before I met him. And he was doing his spiritual search. And he came across somebody, a friend who gave him a lecture. He read that. He asked for more. He changed his story a little bit every now and then, but he got more or less 5 or 10 lectures. And then he wanted to meet Eva. And somehow he found out where she lived, and he just went and knocked on her door one day or one evening. And whatever he said, she let him come in. They talked. This went on but she was also giving trance sessions at some intervals. But at some point, they decided to start dating. And they got married, I think, in 1969. So from 69 until 72, they were married. She was giving the sessions. They were like, if I remember, 3 or possibly 4 different groups. She would give a trance session to this group, and then the next group would come a week later or something of other people, and she would give them these lectures, and they would discuss it. And there were like 4, I think, of these groups. And at some point, Eva decided all these people should meet each other. So they rented a space up in the mountains for a weekend retreat, and everybody went. And this is the first time these groups, some of them didn't even know the other group existed. And out of this came the idea to buy a center, Pathwork Center. And it took them, I don't know, 9 months or something to chase this down and get the money together. So if you'll see, there's a lecture called the Roscoe. I think it's called the Roscoe Lectures. Roscoe is a little town where this meeting happened. And it talks about time to get this together. And then there was, they bought this place. And from what I understand, an hour after they bought it, they said, "Okay, now where are we going to get the money to run it?" So it became a business. You have to chase. And it was enormous amounts of maintenance because it had only been used in the summertime. And they wanted to keep it open all year round. And so before long, the pipes started freezing, and the heating systems failed and things like that because they were being used 24 hours a day instead of just for summer. And it's 2 years later is when I arrived, and the septic systems were all failing. And the health department was not happy with what they were seeing. And the bureaucracy was enormous, and that was more or less what I walked into there, was trying to deal with the health department and the fire department and the lack of facilities and the failing of this or failing of that, finding the money to put it back together. I never traveled with John. Very few people did because it was arduous to do that. Karen did, and a woman named Jackie Carlton did, but we would go to wherever he told us to go. There were a lot of people from Holland. It just was this wave of people from Holland started coming to Phoenicia. So pretty soon we figured out, well, it's cheaper for everybody if we go there. We'll send over 3 or 4 or 5 teachers instead of bringing 40 people the other direction. So we started doing that, and he would send us there, and we would go and do things, and he would show up. Eva never came. She never was a teacher of students. Okay? She would give these lectures. She would be glad to talk about it with people, And she would give individual sessions, but she never taught a class, as far as I know. John would teach, and all of the original trainees would begin to teach too. That was a lot of fun. I went to Belgium, went to France, went to Mexico, eventually to Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and of all places, Ghana. Eva died in March of '79, and she had been ill from cancer for some time. And there was not much doubt that she was going to die, unless the guide saved her. And it was always that kind of hope, I guess, maybe hope or thought or wonder. Is this just going to go on like any other person and die of cancer, right? So we were kind of waiting for some Lazarus kind of thing, I think. The last two lectures, I think I mentioned, she was not even strong enough to give them. She would write a few sentences and then rest. So the last two were not given that way. They were kind of went back to the original. The original lectures, before the ones that are published now, were written by hand, by automatic writing. Many of them weren't saved. Some of them are in what's called the additional material. Discussions about what's going on with Eva were difficult because nobody knew exactly what's going on, and everybody's kind of hoping. And John is very severe on anybody who says she's dying. What are you doing about it? As she got weaker, it was just the people who she agreed to. I never saw her for the last 4 or 5 months of her life, even though she was at Phoenicia at times, because she was being fed special diets. I have a very good friend, a woman named Carolyn Tylove, who's a core therapist in Philadelphia, who was actually hired to be her cook and dietitian. And I've talked to Carolyn about it. So I know a bit about it, but I never was involved. And then I was teaching in Holland, and we got this call at something like 4 o'clock in the morning that she had died. And in March '79. And then about, I guess, 3 or 4 weeks later, we had the memorial service in Phoenicia. It was a winter day, I know that, so it was probably late March. And everybody came from all over the world. And we spread her ashes. Each person got a little ash and put it in the water of the stream. Eva loved the stream. She'd sit by the stream for hours at a time. And then there was a dam there, small dam, pond, maybe the size of this room. She would sit by the side of that and watch the frogs, flies and things. Because he was in Brazil teaching just before he died, and he came back from there ill, which is, I mean, it took 3 months, but he never got well after that. And John always loved to go on some adventure, and they went to this shaman somewhere. He apparently got either an insect bite or something there, and he got sick the next day pretty violently, but then he kind of recovered and he continued. When he came back from Brazil, I saw him that week, and he looked terrible. He said he felt terrible too. And he and I we had this kind of like, once every about 2 months, we would find a time to go out to dinner, just the two of us, and talk. And we did that one more time. And I thought he wasn't going to finish his meal, But he said, no, I'm working on it. I have this pendulum and some crystals he was working with. And then his daughter went over to get him some breakfast because he was sick, or she found him dead in his bed. So he apparently died in his sleep, as far as we know, February. We had a service, and again, people came from all over the world. It turned out that that group of people who were the directors of the various institutes were planning to meet with John a week after he died. So their plans were already set to come to New York at that point. So they just came, and we had the service while they were there, and then they had their meeting. So it was a very rich time. It filled the whole auditorium. There must have been 400 people there. And then we just went home and we said, okay, now what? So most of us assumed that this group of directors who had been already working toward forming this institute would form the institute. And it didn't turn out that way. I was not in any of those meetings, so I don't know. But there were different visions of what should happen. And they were never reconciled to the point where people would agree to it. So I think they had 3 meetings, that meeting and two further meetings, and never again. I know the last one was in Mexico City, and Stewart actually left early, just decided it wasn't going to work and came home. And then he came back, and what it became was that Stewart was going to be the director of the New York, and Karen was going to be the education director, and the two of them ran the place for the next 7 years, at which point I know Stewart was really tired. He was not looking good. And he announced that he wanted to retire and that he wanted people to come and form a board to run the organization, which did happen. We had 5 people volunteer, and he did resign and left it to us. He wanted to be involved as a teacher because he likes teaching. And he was for another at least 2 years, I think. So these kinds of things happen. These are not unusual in the core pathwork history, where 2 or more people have very different and very passionate ideas about what should happen. They try to work the process, but eventually eventually find it so difficult that they kind of let it go away. Somebody leaves, something happens, and there are several of these disagreeable problems laying out there. I could probably name most of them because I had at least some contact with each of them. You know, the lecture that's about preparation for reincarnation says your next life, you are preparing for your next life right now. So maybe they're setting up something where they're setting up karma for the next round. I don't know. I like to think that there's nothing too profound about human affairs. That doesn't, I mean, there are moments, when I get totally wrapped up in my own stuff. But I'm giving that up fast. Look what we did for you. I would be so happy to have John walk in now, and I would feel proud that we are doing what we're doing today. But what we're doing in New York, and what Jorge's doing, I know what Lucia's doing. It is really rich, profound work. And its core is a force in the world. And I'm hearing about it from all kinds of places now. People know about core who have never been to a training. They have curiosity, they have rumors, they have projections, but they know about core. And I'm just so happy about that. Because I think it's one of the richest things that ever happened to me. So come on back, John. Send this thing into the Akashic Records. He can read it, tell him to come back again. Yeah, I would love to have him here. It would be different. I don't think anybody would expect to go back to letting him run it out of his back pocket. But I don't know anybody, actually. I can't think of anybody who would not welcome him back. People had their anger with him, people had their confusion about it, people had their projections. But most of the problems had to do with the fact that he just ran it poorly. And he wouldn't be running it now. Okay? Everybody else, the people who are running it, core in various places in the world, are doing a good job now and would probably continue to do that. And so John would have an honored place and he would do his work and he wouldn't have to worry about all that stuff that he never liked to worry about anyway.